Eight. Brilliant. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Dora Meredith and I'm the director of ODI Europe, which is a new global affairs think tank based here in Brussels, really focused on bringing the global perspective into European policymaking. We're really delighted to be collaborating with UN Women on this important event, which forms part of a series of convenings that we host called the Gender Talks here in Brussels. This is actually, I think, the third one of these events, and it's really a pleasure to have this ongoing collaboration and to see so many of you both here and online joining us in this at this event. Today, we're speaking about the transformative impacts of UNSCR 1325. It's very timely. I'm sure I don't need to tell you, but next year is the anniversary and also for the Beijing Platform for Action. So we think that today is really an important opportunity to be coming together, also, of course, with all of the changes that are happening here, to be really focusing on this agenda. So thank you very much. I'm going to now pass on to Florence, who is the Director of UN Women here in Brussels, to set the scene. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dora, and thank you, ODI, for the reiterated collaboration. I think, first of all, thank you to all the participants who have come to listen and contribute. I'm sure some of you came to the previous editions on other topics, and I'm glad we're still motivated because there's certainly a strong need to continue articulating, collaborating more around the different issues that make up the framework for women's rights, and Beijing being the best example. I think today also probably, and that's maybe rather sadly, calls in a lot of people because the world is quite tormented and women's rights are backtracking. And that is rather the scary part, although we are motivated, of course, to try to contain as much as we can, or even revert if we want to be ambitious. So first of all, of course, thank you to the EU, the European External Action Service. Thank you to NATO. Thank you also to the UN and our colleagues from UN Women who will be online from Kabul, Afghanistan, but also thank you to civil society, I think, Search for Common Ground more than ever, and the ones from other organizations present. We need really to partner, to collaborate, to make the voices of women in conflict situations heard, basically, because they don't always have that opportunity. I think very, very quickly, looking a little bit at, of course, what comes out of, I would say, or 24 years now of work on Resolution 1325, not just as UN Women, but certainly as UN and as other organizations. I think I've said it, and I don't need to go into detail about the conflicts that rid the world today, be it global, be it regional, be it local, a lot of them even forgotten because other ones succeed in the media, at least the attention. Very few probably good examples and good practices, but I'm happy Colombia's here because that's one I was going to cite, at least in terms of women's participation. So it is possible, at least I think you keep the light up that it is possible. And with that, of course, an increase in expenditures on militarization and others, and a decrease in ODA, human rights, social justice, and further. So very, very concerning. And at the same time, a very, very conservative take, not pointing fingers at any specific country or government, but which is really questioning women's rights as and of itself, women's participation in public sphere, or just women's voices. And we'll hear from Afghanistan, I'm sure you're all following. So maybe the positive light is that if we look at 24 years of Resolution 1325, when we left off, we have, first of all, more women in peace negotiations. I think as UN Women and as the UN, this was on top of the Secretary General's agenda. It still is, but it required a proactive effort. And I remember him telling us all the time, we need member states and we need countries to put women forward as ambassadors, because if that's not the case, we cannot have women leading missions in the UN. So it's a joint responsibility. We also, I think, have several countries who followed up and who really made the investment in women mediators, be it from community level to global levels. And we have now networks of women mediators in the different regions, which some of them UN Women supported, some of them supported by other partners. I think from that, we really have a potential of women high level, skilled, experienced that participate, at least at all level as the UN. We have increased, I think I have the figures, I don't want to bore you too much, but they're quite impressive, because from 30% of missions, that is the special political missions or the peacekeeping ones, led by women, we're up almost 15–20% in a time of 3 to 4 years. So that means if you go with a decision, if you go with quotas, it is possible. So if we're not there, it's because we don't want. I mean, we just lack political will. I think that's the clear. On the other side, at the country level, when we look at negotiations, I think we're a bit like around the 15%. So there's still a gap between the global, of course, and the country one. But then I think the biggest gap is probably between women's participation and the fact that the peace agreements are still very much gender blind. So it doesn't mean that because you have women on the table, necessarily women's needs, and I'm not talking only sexual and gender-based violence, I'm talking economic reintegration, I'm talking justice, impunity, not necessarily. And I think that's where at least we have the light of Colombia, who's got a good example in terms of having women participate at the peace table, of having a specifically dedicated gender women's rights chapter in the peace agreements, of having, of course, it's a challenge to have a budget for implementation, we know that, but I think it's at least a sign that it's possible, and it's a good example to follow for others. In terms of sexual and gender-based violence, I don't think I have much to say. We all know maybe the more dramatic pictures, if we look at Eastern Congo, DRC, which year after year, decade after decade, are numbers that just don't decrease despite the different efforts. And I think there's different explanations for that, but certainly, although we're better in delivering service to victims, we try, and when I say we, it's international community, to push forward packages and services and access to justice. Impunity is still very often the rule. And this is, of course, giving perpetrator a sense of impunity, and women victims a sense of not accessing justice, and all that within a chaos situation of conflict, of course, needs to be our priority, especially in the light of anniversary of Resolution 1325. So if we think of picking some priorities for advocacy, for action together, I think this is definitely one of them. But again, I think on the positive life, coming back to Resolution 1325, and for those who know that I just landed in Europe, in the more political world, and spent the last 25 years in the field, I can definitely testify that we have been rolling out, we international community again, and UN Women leading various action plans, national action plans in various countries. Now, there's a lot to say about it. Of course, that doesn't mean everything's fine, but we've moved indeed from 19 countries adopting the so-called NAPs, no national action plans, to 110 now. And countries like, I mean, the latest one I worked on 2 years ago was Chad. So Chad is really the third generation of a NAP, beautiful text. I mean, we can go to, is it budgeted or implemented? So I think there's already a power to have it in and of itself as a milestone, because women's organization can claim accountability. There is something you can hold the government or other partners accountable for. But definitely, that move in the right direction needs to go further. It needs to be budgeted. I think that's, if we look at the figures, only a small portion of the NAPs that have the funding. So there's pros and cons. What I think I would say before ending the floor for you to detail more is that unfortunately the state of the world is what it is. So it means we have more conflict, we have increased sexual, gender-based violence, we have increased military spending. And of course, it is a challenge for women because they're mainly victims, they don't participate. But on the other hand, I mean, if I can dream for next year with all of those and the willing in the room, it's to say, let's take governments or let's take actors to their word and say, okay, you're increasing defense or military budgets. Where's the percentage allocated for women and for gender equality? Because it's not just the 15% ODA that's not matching, and there the funding is decreasing, but where the funding is increasing, women or gender equality is not on the table. And even if that's our only door now, I think it's an important one. And it's worth taking some time to think, and like I said to some of you, and to jointly strategize to see how we can make a stronger plea, since conflict, military, everything's on the table, a dinner table every night. So it is an opportunity at least to talk about it, to ask accountability, and to ask an increase of resources. I think the last word maybe will be for the importance of women's organizations and civil society within that framework. And I think there it is our responsibility as international organizations, UN, NATO, EU, to really open doors, be the voice, and to resource ourselves as well in not just the challenges, but in the creative ideas and opportunities women have come up with. I had the opportunity when I was working in the Sahel, really to look at Sahel, at the networking among women's organizations around peace and security, and seeing women from Tillabéri talking to women then in Mali or in Burkina about, you know, how they have overcome some challenges. That sorority and that networking is also something that I think in our different roles and mandates we can support. So I leave it there. Not too dramatic, but some hope, and we listen to some concrete institutional and country cases. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Florence. I'd now like to introduce our panel to come and sit down. We've got an incredible lineup today. So we're starting with a panel. Please do come up. Firstly, Hilda, who is the Executive Director from Search for Common Ground. Welcome. Thank you. Hilda is, as I say, in charge of all European engagement, partnerships, policy work, and leads the European branch here. Secondly, Jonna, who is a senior advisor on gender equality and women, peace and security at the External Action Service. Welcome. And finally, we have Anna, who is joining us as an advisor to the NATO Secretary General's Special Representative for Women, Peace and Security. Thank you all for being here. We are then, following our panel discussion, we will also then be having a couple of presentations, but I will come on to them a bit later. But first, let's kick off. So the first question we're going to look at is on women, peace and security in practice. So I think I'll start with you, Jonna, if that's okay. The EU's Gender Equality Action Plan has been extended now to 2027, and women, peace and security is a key element within this. Since 2019, the EU has given a strategic approach to women, peace and security. And I think what we were hoping you could tell us is, you know, what are the lessons learned during this time? What achievements and setbacks have now been integrated into thinking going forward? Thank you.
There's another one. Hi, everyone. I hope you all got here dry. It rains every time I'm in this building. And I swear to you, every single time, I promise, at the moment, I'm not in any current recruitment process for the UN. Because if I was, I think mental health of Brussels population might be impacted. In terms of the WPS, I mean, yes, the WPS is very much integrated in the EU Gender Action Plan 3, which has been perhaps the one key leveraging item, and I would say helping to have an operational arm to operationalize and make more practical the women, peace and security commitments. And this happens very much through the what we call country-level implementation plans, which is a tool for our delegations on the ground, which we have a large number of, to engage on gender equality topics, and women, peace and security is one of these. And quite a number of the delegations have therefore looked at how the women, peace and security is part of delegations, either financial aspects of their portfolio or as a political aspects. But this is, of course, also recognizing that, and in a way, it's unfortunate that what easily gets dropped out is that all the other elements are also relevant for the WPS when it comes to conflict contexts. So if we look at women's economic empowerment in conflict contexts, that is also women, peace and security, or in post-conflict context, because it loops very much into the fourth pillar of the WPS, which is the recovery. So all these elements together, I would say, are helpful in advancing the WPS. This does bring one practical element, which is a struggle in terms of monitoring, is that if you look at just OECD gender marker, there is no separate element in it that would separate conflict or WPS intervention. So it's very difficult to say financially how much EU does spend on these aspects. But if it were, I'm sure it would be quite a notable number on the ground. Lessons we've learned is, I would say, one of the key aspects has been the recognition of the political side of the women, peace and security agenda. And this is one of the reasons it is in the GAP3, but why it's also a political agenda through the strategic approach and through Women, Peace and Security Action Plan, as well as Council conclusions that the EU has. So we have all the EU 27 agreeing to Women, Peace and Security approach that we have as a common approach. We have set of priorities through the Council conclusions. And we've been able to, within the last couple of years, elevate this even more in terms of political engagements to the PSC, for example. Just an example, this year, the EU's Political and Security Committee had already debated women, peace and security twice, which is as a separate agenda item. In addition, of course, every time this happens, it also triggers into other discussions in the other thematical or geographical discussions. Similarly, the EU has the Women, Peace and Security Task Force, which is reinvigorated, and this year we were able to hold a joint meeting with EU Women, Peace and Security Task Force and the EU's working group for COAPR for the Africa. And we discussed Sahel and Sahel-related developments in this context from the Women, Peace and Security angle. I would say these are some of the lessons learned that we're trying to even do more than with the other working groups potentially in the future, and how we can leverage in other political space. Lastly, perhaps I would add, actually I'll leave for the next question, my next one.
Thank you, that's great. Anna, coming to you, given the current geopolitical landscape, and Florence was talking there about the increased militarization, can you tell us a little bit about NATO's strategy to ensure that the WPS agenda continues to advance even within that context? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I think as we started out today, when we were talking about next year marking the 25th anniversary of Resolution 1325, it's a good time to take stock and reflect on the future. And talking about the future when it comes to NATO, I think it's safe to say that the Women, Peace and Security agenda is as relevant as it has ever been. And I say this also because of the security environment that we're experiencing or living in today, which remains defined by strategic competition, pervasive instability, and recurrent shocks. NATO's work in this environment must be comprehensive and it must be strategic. And that requires constant consideration of gender perspectives throughout. Because we know that setbacks in global peace and security often go hand in hand with setbacks to gender equality. And we know, as we discussed earlier, that globally women increasingly face threats to their rights and barriers to their full, equal, safe, and meaningful participation. Our fundamental values are under growing pressure, and this matters to NATO. NATO is an alliance based on democratic principles. So to answer the question, what are we doing? Well, I'm happy to share that our heads of states and government endorsed a new policy for women, peace and security at the NATO summit in July, thereby establishing a clear vision for the advancement of NATO's women, peace and security agenda, allowing NATO to better navigate these times of global transformation while contributing to a more gender equal future. So what are the key considerations that will set the stage for the future of women, peace and security at NATO? Well, first, a new policy is centered around the implementation of NATO's 2022 strategic concepts, focusing women, peace and security around the core of NATO's work. So deterrence and defense, crisis prevention and management, and cooperative security. This means mainstreaming women, peace and security into everything we do at NATO. While centering women, peace and security around NATO's core business, we remain mindful that NATO is one actor within a global women, peace and security community. And so the policy speaks the global women, peace and security language, aligning NATO's women, peace and security objectives more directly with the 4 pillars of the global agenda. It also underlines the importance of engaging with partners and civil society. Third, the policy recognizes the crucial importance of gender-responsive leadership and accountability, and looks to further bolster the mechanisms of political military cooperation on women, peace and security across the alliance. And fourth, our new policy commits NATO for the first time to advance work on challenges and threats like gender disinformation and technologically facilitated gender-based violence. The new policy was a key deliverable at the Washington summit. And I would like to believe that with it, NATO will continue to make important strides on the women, peace and security agenda. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So Hilda, coming to you, we've heard the EU kind of frameworks and the same there from NATO, new policies in place, trying to, push momentum forward on this agenda. Search for Common Ground has been working for more than 40 years in violent conflicts and in particular on peace building. Perhaps you could share some practical examples of your application of this agenda within your work.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Thanks for inviting us to the conversation. We're happy to be part of it. I mean, we're of course a very different organization from the EU and NATO, but that doesn't prevent us from working together, right? But I'd like to maybe outline a few elements in which we can bring added value as civil society. I think Florence pointed out there's need for more synergies there, but I think first of all, Surge, like other NGOs, we have a very large networks of local partners. I think annually we partner with over 650 organizations across all these countries where we're present, often with very small organizations, right? A youth-led organization in an IDP camp, a women-led organization that is dealing with HIV positive people. So it's a big diversity of organizations that we are able to tap into. And what we try to do as much as we can is elevate their voices also when it comes to peace talks, right? There is definitely a tendency when we talk about track 1 and track 2 conversations, we often see in some contexts recycling of the same women, women who have access, women who are able to speak English, women who have a certain credibility with international partners, which leaves out a lot of other voices. And so what we're trying to do is bridge that gap. And for example, in Yemen, we have a big network of insider mediator women. What do they experience in their communities? How can we elevate their voices when the UN envoy is coming for peace talks, right? So that is something that we're working on a lot. Have the pleasure to have our Sudan country director here, Kawthar, and she was just in Geneva for the peace talk, so we'll be able to hear from her in a while as well. So bridging that gap is for us very important and bringing those voices. Secondly, because we have teams on the ground, we have presence, we have country teams that are mostly composed of nationals, we pay a lot of attention to what we call multi-partial teams, meaning we want to make sure in any conflict where we're present that we have people on our team who represent different walks of society and we're able to bridge gaps, which also means that we have access and credibility and we're not perceived as coming in with an external agenda, but we can be considered as a convener and a facilitator, which is particularly for WPS very important. I think thirdly, what sets us aside a little bit and what we've been doing an incredible amount of learning on is how to become ourselves a better partner to local women organizations, which is the talk of the town in many capitals, but how to concretely do it and how to adapt our own systems to do it it's a much more tricky process. And so we've spent a lot of time piloting that we have some large programs funded by the EU and the US government to support women-led organizations. And so what are we learning from that? Is how to overcome some of those obstacles. And just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, I know it's hard to always get the OECD data we need, but I do have one figure that I often refer to from a few years ago. But that if you look at all the funding that goes to gender equality in fragile settings, only 0.39% reaches women-led organizations, 0.39%. So it's an infinite amount that actually reaches organizations who are led by women. I know the UNSCR has made a commitment to make that times 5, but 0.39% times 5 is still a very small figure, right? So how do we set up our own systems to be better partner to those organizations? And that comes from very practical things. How do you have to submit an application? What languages can they be in? Can they be submitted in a paper format for people who don't have a steady internet access? Can they be, do organizations in rural countrysides even know about a funding opportunity? What is the reporting requirements? Do we ask organizations to already have an audit? And all of these things, each and every one of them, while we understand where they come from, they are obstacles that are needing to be overcome. So that is something we're working on a lot. Another element that we found in a lot of the places where we work is that international funding can put local organizations in competition with each other. So can we try as much as we can to remove that competitive phase? One thing we've done in a lot of countries where we try to support those organizations is map out those organizations ourselves first, and then invite them into a room to go through a kind of joint design process. So we avoid that level of competition, and we really see we can create new synergies around it. And then lastly, the last big lessons, and then I'll pass it back to you on a bit. It's about, we've had to do a lot of learning. We're a relatively large NGO. All our systems are made for the EU and US government and UK, etc. We need to do a lot of adaptation in our own systems, and we need to understand risks better, and we need to be able to divide risks better, and then feedback to our main donors what it is that they can change on their end to make the funding more accessible.
Great, thank you very much. Now talking a little bit about some other challenges in the agenda implementation. And again, I'm just going to stick with the financing theme. Florence noted how often there isn't a budget linked to a lot of this work. I wondered what role the EU can be playing in advocating and supporting sufficient financing, and how you see that, Joanna.
Thank you. I would say, as a donor, EU, of course, is one of the probably largest. When I'm saying EU, I mean also the EU member states. If we look at who finances women, peace and security across the world, it is either the EU or the EU member states, definitely in the top 10, very prominently figured, including civil society, oftentimes through UN entities, UN Women. Similarly, we just had an engagement last week with the Office of the SRSG on sexual violence in conflict, who was very clear that indeed it is EU member states that finance largely her work in the largest. But how can we do more is also element of this. And I would go here from both in terms of financing, but also in terms of countries taking accountability. And you have several tools through which we engage politically, right? We have political dialogues, we have human rights dialogues, we have security dialogues with other countries. So these are spaces where we can bring up, including these kind of topics. That great that you have a Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan. Do you also have a budget for it? Can you, like we would recommend attaching finances for this. Similarly, we have met several countries in accession process right now to the EU. This again is it's a platform ultimately for the countries to align with EU acquis, and part of this also aligning with the EU's common security and foreign policy, and our commitments also then on women, peace and security. So this is another opportunity to bring up the discussions on budgets and accountability. And ultimately, I would say it also goes beyond financing. It's also about advocating the agenda in itself, which continues to be still, I mean, it's either side topic, or it's a topic that we only discuss women, peace and security, and it's been, what, 15 years? 25 years, hang on, 25 years since the launch of Women, Peace and Security. And I feel that sometimes the discussion continues being, why is women's participation important? Again, like, I think I've heard all the possible arguments in the world on this, and very little of them being discussed in strategic parts of the discussion. Why don't we discuss women, peace and security when we discuss all the other political important topics as element of it? And that's yet where we need to move. And this is certainly EU has a role then to place that advocacy space, whether it comes to multilateral space, holding up the agenda when it comes to, let's say, renewal of UN peacekeeping mandates. And I would say note here, EU countries are normally the ones who have women, peace and security as a priority in their memberships to UN Security Council. They often have it, I think always, pretty much WPS is one of their priorities for Security Council nominations. And ultimately, then it comes also to partnerships with, nevertheless, with the broader world, because we are not the only entity in the world holding up the mandate. WPS was not born from the EU, so it is very much also recognizing that geographical south, if that's a or just overall continents, whether it comes to Africa, Latin America, Asian countries have notable roles to play on women, peace and security. A lot of them do a lot. And so it's brokering that space. Where can we have that common ground? Where can we together advance women, peace and security, also in financial terms, on key elements of the agenda? And I just want to go back to the CSOs, because you mentioned CSOs and continue being one of the key partners for the EU, also in terms of hearing what is happening in different parts of the ground. And we do liaise a lot on the either delegation level or in the headquarters with women's civil society, with women peace builders, also engage a lot with Search for Common Ground and others. And very much the financing comes back to us as well. And we try to leverage and be the broker for financing, but the finances are limited. So it has to be relying on the shoulders of everyone, I would say.
Brilliant, thank you. Anna, coming to you, can you tell us a little bit about how NATO thinks about some of these challenges? How do you, bring the different member states along with you on this agenda, noting that there are different levels of political will?
Yes, thank you. Well, first I want to say that the fact that NATO issued its first policy on women, peace and security in 2007, that the position of the Secretary General Special Representative for Women, Peace and Security was established as early as 2012, and that our 2022 strategic concept calls for integration of women, peace and security across all of NATO's core tasks and mentions gender equality as a reflection of NATO's values, is also a testament to the unified commitment that allies have to advance the agenda, the women, peace and security agenda. Also, our new women, peace and security policy is negotiated with and by allies, and it's endorsed by our heads of state and government. So in the policy, it actually underlines that the advancement of NATO's women, peace and security agenda is a shared responsibility. And that requires active commitment and accountability from allies, from NATO political and military leadership, and also staff throughout the enterprise. But of course, recognizing that the implementation of the agenda needs continual progress, advocacy and amplifying the message, maybe if you can put it that way, also forms a very important part of the role of the special representative. And so we want to make sure that we're walking the women, peace and security talk, which we've been talking, as Jonna pointed to earlier. So just to give you a few examples, strengthening NATO's connection with the national women, peace and security priorities. This is a priority for the special representative. We believe that it will be key to reinforce our collective achievements, and that this also can be key to reaching sustainable change across the alliance. And to support this effort at the political level, the special representative hosted the first meeting of allied women, peace and security, gender equality, and feminist foreign policy leadership at NATO headquarters in January, And she plans to make this an annual event. Jonna attended as well. The NATO Committee for Gender Perspectives allows for similar synergies at the military level. Leadership engagement, that remains crucial, which is why we were quite adamant on inscribing gender responsive leadership and accountability as a strategic objective of the new policy. And since the special representative took up her post, she has also organized women, peace and security ministerial events during the NATO summits, also to highlight the fundamental importance of women's participation and leadership. During the Washington summit in July, the special representative co-hosted the Women, Peace and Security Roundtable with the U.S. Ambassador at Large for Global Women Issues, following which the U.S. Secretary of State hosted a special Women, Peace and Security reception. Another important Women, Peace and Security deliverable or outcome at the Washington summit was the approval of the first NATO-Ukraine Comprehensive Assistance Package Trust Fund. Sorry, it's a mouthful. Trust fund project that supports the procurement of women's body armor, uniforms, and boots for Ukrainian servicewomen, demonstrating basically the advancement of the Women, Peace and Security agenda through the NATO-Ukraine partnership action. And actually, before finishing on the uniforms, earlier this year, the special representative, in collaboration with the U.S. Ambassador at NATO and Armed Women Now, a Ukrainian NGO, organized an exhibition on female-specific uniforms and body armor to showcase basically how important this gear is to ensure that servicewomen can operate in the safest possible conditions. And, you know, some might wonder, like, what kind of effect an exhibition can have, but I actually thought it was very useful because everybody can see the necessary gender differences in the body armor and the uniforms, but also because it was a very down-to-earth operational issue that kind of makes people feel the agenda at work in a very practical, everyday way. So it was like this demonstration of the tangible, concrete difference that the agenda can make. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think that's great to have a number of really concrete examples of how, you're really trying to work on this in practice. Finally, Hild, coming to you. You've mentioned in your first answer how working with local actors, some of the challenges that you face. I wondered if you could expand on that a little bit about, implementing the WPS agenda. And kind of, as has been mentioned, how do we move from talk to action? What is preventing that from happening on the ground?
So I think it's both an operational and a political intention, right? And I think the operational side, I went into it, and I think I saw a lot of people nodding when I talk about the obstacles for accessing funding for women-led organizations. So I think that there's a lot to be done in that area. And I think unfortunately, I don't know how people in the audience feel about that, but I actually see that there's localization agenda, at the same time there's cuts to ODA. So what does that mean for the localization agenda? I think it's actually going to go counter. I think donors are going to try to, with the limited ODA they have, they're going to try to channel more to some of the bigger ones, right? So that's a big question mark. But when I say political, it is also political and ideological, because we have actually sometimes seen in some contexts where we work, the constraints to work on WPS in very, very closed spaces. I'm thinking Yemen, I'm thinking Afghanistan, I'm thinking now Sahel. Of course, they come from the national context, but they also come from politically and ideological decisions in European capitals and elsewhere. If there are European donors who decide not to engage anymore with the national government and who only want to fund humanitarian aid, it's the worst possible decision for WLOs, for women-led organizations in those countries, right? It cuts the essential funding that they need in a very, very critical moment. So for me, that's a political question. How can we have a conversation about countries where we don't agree with the national government anymore? How can we continue supporting civil society, women-led peace-building initiatives that are very much needed in those contexts, and that are not humanitarian, right? We've seen in so many contexts these women-led organizations and all of a sudden shifting to humanitarian aid because that's where the money is going to. But there's many other needs that need to still really, really be foreseen for. So that's one big obstacle that we see that really needs to be overcome. And another one that I want to touch upon, which I'm sure is going to ring true with a lot of people, is mental health support. We see that over and over again in a lot of the peace building programming that we do. I think a lot of organizations are going the extra mile and providing mental health support to participants in our peace building programs. But we see that the women leaders themselves who lead these civil society organizations are in absolute need of it. We did a survey last year in Central African Republic where we support these groups. And I cannot tell you how many women, we have about 20 or 30 women leaders of these organizations, how many of them report insomnia, how many of them report having grief and having experienced losses themselves, how many of them experience post-traumatic stress disorder and even suicidal thoughts. And these are women who are like, they go speak in front of the parliament. These are women whom you may invite to come and speak on an international panel, but they're dealing with a lot and they're holding a lot on their shoulders. So how can we support them and provide the mental health support that they need? And then lastly, this goes a little bit back to the operational and funding model. We really need to move away from activity funding. We really need to move away from project funding for these women-led organizations. Recognize that for these organizations to become strong and sustainable, they need core funding and they need to be able to invest in a finance person, in a meal person, in their director, to be able to build that out. And we see so many donors, that's where they scrap in your budget, right? Which for us is hard, but let alone for a small women-led organization in many of the places where we work. So that need for core support over the long run is really something that we'll continue to push for.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to that great panel. We're going to come back to you in a second with some questions from the audience. But first, we've got some fantastic presentations, particularly on Afghanistan. So I'd like to introduce firstly Caitlin, who, let me just find my bios, to come on up. So Caitlin is a program specialist on women, peace and security with UN Women in Afghanistan, and she is joining us online. And we will then be joined, again, find the right piece of paper, by Miriam, who is the Executive Director of DROPS Afghanistan, which was established in Afghanistan in 2014 with the aim of building democratic governance through evidence-based research and policy and capacity building. And she is also a research associate within the politics and governance team at ODI. So thank you very much for joining us, Miriam, who we're a bit unsure if she has joined, but first of all, we will kick off with, sorry, a slight technical issue, with Miriam first.
Caitlin.
With Caitlin. Excellent. Caitlin, over to you for a short intervention on the realities from your side. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. I think Afghanistan really is a relevant case study to the first panel discussion that really brought up the themes of challenges around funding to local women's organizations, ongoing issues with the need to walk the talk, as well as thinking about, what the impact of spending on militarism is for the women, peace and security agenda. And Afghanistan really does highlight the urgency to rethink and adapt the agenda to the challenges that we are seeing in complex peace and security settings today. Before the Taliban takeover in August 2021, as we know, a range of stakeholders, Afghan women, civil society, NGOs, governments, INGOs, UN agencies were all involved in leading and implementing funding diverse WPS actions. This ranged from advocating for women's participation at the Doha talks, advancing different iterations of a national action plan in Afghanistan, all the way to local women's organizations seeking to build consensus at the subnational level on what peace-building priorities were for the country. It's important to note that while there was visibility, funding, and a certain degree of progress on the agenda, it certainly was never easy. Afghanistan has long been one of the most dangerous places to be a women's rights leader. If you look at the data between 2005 and 2020, Afghan women were excluded from 80% of peace negotiations. So even before the Taliban took power, and the situation changed dramatically, there were several challenges to kind of implementing and realizing the agenda. And of course, with the takeover, many of the work around the agenda became obsolete overnight. The peace process disintegrated. There was no longer a security sector left to reform from a gender perspective due to constraints in how the international community works with de facto authorities. And many of the structures and coordination functions disintegrated. And now, of course, as I think everyone in the room likely knows, there are over 70 decrees, directives, practices curtailing the rights of women and girls across the country, including the latest morality law that was introduced last month. So in a way, there's a need greater than ever before to revitalize what the WPS agenda means in contexts with de facto authorities that have severely constrained civic space, similar to our colleague from Search for Common Ground mentioned, where the presence of de facto authorities really does constrain the way that the international community can engage with Afghanistan, and where common WPS interventions that we see across the world and negotiation approaches that we might have used in different countries simply are not effective. So as UN Women Afghanistan at the country office level, we've really sought to rethink and adapt what the WPS agenda means in a context with de facto authorities, where state power and logic is exercised through the oppression of women. And we have done this by focusing on kind of the 4 foundational elements of the WPS agenda. The first is women's civil society, which many panelists have already raised. Women's civil society has always been the center of gravity for the WPS agenda. It's why the WPS agenda made it to the Security Council almost 25 years ago. And civil society is also the driver behind gender equality gains across the world. Therefore, a core focus of our office at of our work at the country level is providing flexible long-term funding to women's organizations to undertake a range of work, including holding space for women's rights at the community level, documenting the situation on the ground, and even running social cohesion initiatives in parts of the country. We don't often talk about this work publicly as UN Women, like many other international stakeholders, because the protection concerns around women human rights defenders and leaders continue. The second way that we've navigated this complex crisis is by really going back to the basics and looking at the participation pillar of the agenda. In collaboration with the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, as well as IOM, we've created a dynamic quarterly consultation cycle that seeks to gather the diverse views of Afghan women and connect these views to policymakers. With a large exodus of the international community in August 2021, the pathways for women inside the country have been severely reduced because they do not have the same access to decision makers as they have in the past. So this consultation cycle really seeks to meaningfully consult Afghan women across the country. We now have reached all 34 provinces in the country to ask them what they think of their current situation, reflect on how the different decrees are impacting their lives, and then connect these views and recommendations to policymakers in capitals across the world. This quarterly cycle is aligned to the scheduled meetings on Afghanistan at the Security Council level, and the process has been also adapted over the past 2 years to kind of ensure that the information that we're gathering is aligned to different policy windows, including Doha, Human Rights Council discussions, and more. A third area of focus in navigating this complexity of the context is really focusing on generating research and analysis to inform policy and programming. The aim of this work is to understand from a data perspective what the impact is on the ground for Afghan women, as well as to break down the common typecasting that women are victims of war, and that, you know, this kind of focus on humanitarian work has also kind of reiterated this trope that we see that women are in need of protection. One example of this area of work is earlier this year, we published the Afghanistan Gender Country Profile with funding support from the European Union. And this really was the first comprehensive cross-sectoral gender analysis of Afghanistan following the takeover. And our final area of work is around norms and standards, again, a foundation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. As we know, Afghanistan is the most severe women's rights crisis in the world, and we have been leading work around thinking about the relevance of the toolbox that we have as the international community to address this type of crisis. So the aim here is to start bringing experts in the international community together with Afghan women to think about how we can push the boundaries of our current thinking on WPS implementation to ensure that our and tactics are fit for the problems of the 21st century. In this area of work, we're also focusing on creating pathways for Afghan women to represent themselves in international forums, again, because the long trajectory in Afghanistan has been the exclusion of these voices in different peace and security discussions. So just to wrap up briefly, the mounting women's rights crisis in Afghanistan does pose direct challenges to WPS agenda's implementation in Afghanistan, and also demands how we rethink the agenda in an era that is marked by an increased number of people living under de facto authorities, increasing strains to civic space, and in also a context, as was mentioned in the beginning, that has seen a decline in multilateralism and kind of the strength of the women's rights regime globally. And that despite the situation, I must say that Afghan women are truly showing their unwavering commitment to continue advocating for rights at the community level. Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin. That's extremely interesting, and thank you for joining us. We'll come back to you at the questions, if that's okay. Miriam, could I bring you in now just to talk a little bit about how you're adjusting your work as a CSO in a country also facing these challenges?
Sure. Thank you very much. Really happy to be a part of the discussion. It certainly is incredibly timely. So for us here, I mean, as we all know, next year, as we mark the 25th anniversary of 1325, we note that, you know, this is a great achievement for the global women's movement as a whole. But from where we stand as an organization and the 15 years we operated, the 15 years I was based in Afghanistan and 10 years that our organization worked inside of the country, Resolution 1325 certainly stands at a crossroads for us. For years, you know, we recognized the intense debate about the gap between the resolution's objectives and the political and financial commitment needed to achieve them. But what we've noticed is that the resolution's limited capacity to bridge the intent of international policymakers with the realities on the ground has been one of the greatest challenges, but it's not been the only challenge. Similar to peace building in some instances, it has a largely top-down and parachute approach. And we've seen this during the Republic. And I account that for the quick reversal of rights during the Taliban regime. A lot of those achievements we had, some were concrete, but as we can now see and look back, a lot of it was also quite superficial. And it had to do with the way WPS was treated by the local government, the national government in Afghanistan, at times by the international community, and at times by civil society organizations as well. It requires a lot more time than given to institutionalize the pillars of WPS. And oftentimes we don't give it that time, but our expectations are quite high. Recent peace processes, like Caitlin just mentioned, those in Afghanistan, highlight these gaps. And they also showed the devastating consequences for women when they're not achieved. Afghan women are enduring the harshest effects of this disconnect. Under the Taliban regime, they face systematic exclusion from public life, education, and employment. The Taliban's repressive policies are not only do they starkly contradict the principles of 1325, but the principles of women's rights in Islam. Women in Afghanistan face not only the heightened risks of violence and sexual exploitation and displacement common in conflict zones, but also a deliberate, ideologically, and now legal driven efforts to erase their presence and rights from the public sphere. 1325 is failing to meet its objectives. And as a consequence, we are in a period witnessing a backlash, of course, in Afghanistan, but as mentioned earlier, globally. As we reflect on the last 2 decades since the adoption of 1325, we must confront harsh reality. While there is global recognition that women are disproportionately affected by war, there is still insufficient action to address this inequality. Women's voices not only continue to be marginalized, but their representation across security institutions and peace processes are declining, especially environments in the global south, which have or are on the brink of authoritarian regimes. We now live in a global landscape that presents incredibly difficult and new challenges. The rise of extremist ideologies, the erosion of democratic norms globally, and the diminishing focus on gender equality are creating very complex obstacles for advancing women's rights in conflict settings, like that which you see in Afghanistan. These are not just abstract threats. They have very real and deadly consequences for women who are on the front lines of these struggles every day. Recent trends show the WPS agenda is increasingly being folded into broader discussions on women's empowerment and gender equality. While this broader inclusion is essential, it risks diluting the specific focus needed to address the unique challenges faced by women in conflict and post-conflict settings. We must ensure that the essence and particularities of WPS agenda are fully integrated into international policy, not just in name, but in practice. It is time to thoroughly examine the WPS agenda in theory and practice to make it more relevant and effective for today's world. We must reassess its core principles and its broader agenda, asking some very difficult questions. What is working? What is not? Why are we not seeing the results we need? We must draw on local experiences, especially those of Afghan women who know better than anyone what it means to fight for peace, security, and equality under oppressive regimes. 3 things that I would recommend at this particular stage would be, 1, to explore more agile approaches that can adapt to rapidly changing realities on the ground in conflict zones and in environments with authoritarian regimes. This requires a new level of commitment, flexibility, and responsiveness from all stakeholders, governments, international organizations, civil society, and grassroots movements. We need to answer the question, how can we tailor engagement and local ownership in WPS efforts to meet the challenges in these new and harsher spaces? We must transform WPS into a tool that the international community can use as leverage in its engagement with authoritarian regimes like the Taliban. We cannot believe, trust, or concede to them. We must operate from the perspective that, quite frankly, some don't change, and utilize WPS as a means to convince them. Lastly, we have to redefine the local. To make progress on promoting WPS and local ownership, we must redefine who the local is and broaden the term to encapsulate the ever-changing face of the local. While local knowledge of conflict drivers and context-specific definitions of peace is crucial, successful WPS, and also this pertains to peace building, now requires understanding how national, diasporan, and international dynamics affect local peace efforts. International donors and peace actors must be flexible and open to partnering with a diverse range of local actors, recognizing that legitimacy and community buy-in are not guaranteed by localness alone. Now more than ever, it is vital that gender equality and women's empowerment remain at the center of our efforts. As we move towards the 25th anniversary of 1325, we must align global agendas with local realities. This will require reflection from the international community on how they should do this as they renew their commitments with urgency and, I hope, purpose. On the other hand, civil society organizations too have a responsibility here. We will have to ask ourselves, what tools do we need to meet the peace and security needs of women in our countries, especially when local realities are now clashing more than ever with international agendas that are becoming more security-oriented and isolationist in doctrine. So here we need a very serious conversation between WPS stakeholders and local organizations and local women's organizations. This discussion, I believe, has happened, but I don't think we're asking ourselves the right questions now, considering the changing dynamics on the ground. And the responsibility is both ways. I think they both have to meet at a particular point in order for WPS to be able to actually address these nuanced and very difficult issues we are currently facing around the globe and particularly in Afghanistan. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Miriam. That's really greatly appreciated. And we'll certainly come back to you during the questions. So thank you. Now, before we open to the floor, I know we've got a couple of quick first interventions, but then I invite you all to start thinking of your questions. So first of all, from ICRC, Simona, I believe that you have some thoughts. Let's just see if there's the microphone.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, panelists and organizers, for bringing us together here today. As the ICRC, obviously, I'm going to speak about international humanitarian law. It is sometimes, international humanitarian law is sometimes referred to as the laws of war, and is sometimes therefore misconstrued as lying at odds with the promotion of peace. But I would like to remind everyone in this room that IHL's objective is to preserve humanity in the darkest times that we are observing a lot also today. Although IHL, international humanitarian law, does not address how or by what means peace is achieved, it does not stand in the way of achieving it. On the contrary, it shares the objective also with the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And on this, I would just like maybe to make 3 quick points on how IHL aligns with the Women, Peace and Security agenda from a humanitarian perspective that we care. The faithful application of international humanitarian law requires an understanding of the gendered impacts of conflict that we're observing across the globe today. And it is also international humanitarian law combined with the principles of humanity, impartiality and neutrality that lie at the heart of protecting persons affected by conflict, no matter who they are, where they find themselves, and in what situations they currently in, whether they're civilians, combatants, wounded, or prisoners of war. Secondly, on sexual violence, the ICRC calls for an integration of the clear prohibition of sexual violence under international humanitarian law into national laws, policies, military doctrine, and training. We see that survivors of sexual violence often suffer from double violations when they're trying to seek services for support. And therefore, we call upon a change of domestic law and policy changes. And we've heard this before, that they must be known, respected, and acted upon, and not just remain empty words. At the same time, a call for restraint is something that we are usually promoting to avoid unnecessary suffering wherever we can. Thirdly, on the full and meaningful participation of women in all aspects of societies and economies as a critical pathway to peace. We know, and we've heard it before, and I think we're going to hear about Colombia, that at the end of the day, it's those who control assets that will have a say when important decisions are being made, which also means that today we observe an insufficient inclusion of issues, humanitarian considerations that mainly and primarily affect women, first and foremost, but overall societies as a whole that are inadequately addressed. If we think, for example, of the issue of missing persons or the right of families to know what happened to their loved ones. And it is with this where I would like to close and just maybe give you a bit of food for thought that there's many ways of getting to peace, hopefully, but first ones are usually humanitarian ones. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I'd like to invite Ka Wafa, who is the country director for Search, to also say a few words.
Thank you so much. My name is Khawat Maki. I'm the country director for Sudan. I will not talk about our program in Sudan. because it is a program that have been going through kind of like continuous changing since the start of the war. We moved our office from Khartoum to Madani, where the second attack happened. And now we have staff scattered in different states, still operating, still continuing our programs inside Sudan. I actually want to talk about our participation in a peace talk in Geneva, where we brought 17 women from different parts of the civil society in Sudan. Two of them actually brought them from inside Sudan, inside Khartoum. It was a challenge. We managed to bring them all the way to Geneva, where they participated in track 1.5 diplomacy, it was the first time ever for the Sudanese women to participate in that high level peace talk. The agenda was around the humanitarian action. It was around the atrocity that happened in Sudan to the women, with a lot of sexual violence happened for the Sudanese women, as well as sexual enslavement, which is very few people talk about it, unfortunately. So we managed to advise the first envoy for Sudan. The women are invited by the State Department. Search for Common Ground is the one coordinated and managed to bring the women to Geneva. Most of them are our network that are built before the war, and we continue connecting with them. Some of them, they flee the country outside of Sudan, in Uganda, Egypt, and South Sudan. Some of them, they're still inside Sudan. And through our work, we try to connect both of the network from outside Sudan and inside Sudan, and we kind of like unify their voices to go to the international community. I will be happy to answer more questions when it comes, but I think this is one of the achievements that the Sudanese women, they managed to kind of like have since ever, especially in Sudan currently. Women are kind of like the one who are blamed for the war. I don't know how. but because the Sudanese women are the one, they led the revolution against throwing the former regime. So now the general population kind of like blaming them for what is happening in Sudan now. So there is a little empathy in Sudan for the women right now from both parties. And we cannot, as a country program, kind of like sit and we talk about women, peace and security, you know, because these are the issues none of the two parties want to talk about, you know. So in Sudan, we always kind of like sugarcoat it with another kind of like interventions, you know. So we kind of like hide it under maybe capacity building or, you know, or like economic empowerment, you know, like different issues, you know, so we can continue working there. I think I'll stop here. I don't want to take a lot of your time, but I am happy to answer questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Wow, what a huge variety of speakers and so much valuable insight. A huge thank you to everybody who's spoken. If you've not been to one of these events before, we try to make them a very kind of open, informal discussion. So please do raise your hand if you've got a comment, a question, or anything to add. Oh, yes, actually, Maria. Do you mind? Thank you. And please do, if you want, introduce yourself.
Thank you. I'm Sandra Malone. I'm the chairwoman of Search for Common Ground Europe, but I'm also actually here to represent the Elles du Sahel, which is a women's network from across the Sahel. Thank you so much to the organizers of the Gender Talk. It's great and super interesting to say the least. Now, I want to be action-oriented, and Hilde and Kawater have covered the search for common ground, I would say, more than perfectly. So I would like to invite everybody, actually, who can be in Brussels on the 30th of October, so at the end of next month, to what I hope will be a very useful hands-on event, which will bring 17 women from across the Sahel, who are the Elle du Sahel, to Brussels in order to give the report on the series of roundtables that we have held across the Sahel and in Brussels all year, the point of which was to gather women's-led organizations from across the Sahel on the Women, Peace and Security agenda, specifically to say what it is that is missing and what could be useful. And this is from the Sahelian women's perspective. So more later on the invitation, but it won't be limited in terms of its usefulness, the report and the advocacy, because a lot of the points are pertinent to any region in the world and to any woman in the world. So thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions in the room or comments? Oh, yes, I can see one there.
Hi, thank you so much, everyone. I actually have a question for Jonna, and I can't see Jonna, so I might quickly stand up. I'm Flor Coolidge. I'm with the International Press, as is my colleague Emma. We're both in the gender and conflict team. Many of you have touched on this global trend of backtracking on women's rights, decreasing attention to gender equality. Something we haven't mentioned yet, which we're looking at with our colleague at the moment, is the upcoming US elections and risks associated with one particular outcome, especially in the field of access to sexual and reproductive health in conflict areas as well as other countries. And so we know that during Donald Trump's first term in office, he expanded something that's called the Global Gag Rule, which basically constricts what organizations that want to use US funding can do with all their funding, including non-US funding, and restricts their ability to provide services linked to abortion, even referrals and so on. And those who've been able to influence Trump in the past are pushing for him to widen it further if he were to get a second term, to basically apply to a much broader pool of funding, humanitarian funding, UN contributions and so on. And so we're very interested, Jonas, to hear from you if the EU and specific EU member states might be able to take a leading role again on kind of stepping into that gap if it does happen, knowing how difficult the funding environment is, knowing that some of the countries who took the lead last time, I think, including your own, have very different governments in place now. So how do you see the EU's ability to step into that very specific potential? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Before we come to you, can I just ask, are there any other questions? Or one at the back there, and then we'll take them as a group, and if anyone else wants to comment.
Hi, thanks. I'm Louis. I'm EU Advocacy Advisor at Care International. I've got a question for you, Hilda, actually, because I was very happy that you were talking about support to local civil society organization, women rights organization, and notably the idea of core costs. And in an environment where ODA is being cut, mostly around most donor countries, what role do we as big NGOs have to play in maybe championing these new financing and reporting systems that we can really push to try and champion a new way to maybe function in the whole aspect of transforming the aid sector? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions or any online? Oh, yes. I think for online it's better. Thank you.
Fantastic. First of all, I wanted to thank the panel for the brilliant presentations. So I am Daniel. I will contribute to the Search for Common Ground invasion today. I work for the Search for Common Ground policy team. And echoing on Mariam's brilliant intervention regarding where she also mentioned, approaching hostile national contexts. So I think that Afghanistan was a big lesson for the West in terms of the consequences of isolation as a method of dealing with these environments. And while, yes, INGOs and local NGOs need to meet, and it's a conversation that definitely needs to happen, as Mariam mentioned. I was curious on what are some of the reflections also going on at EU level in terms of rethinking the EU's approach regarding hostile or extremely sensitive contexts such as Afghanistan or others, and particularly in terms of maintaining support for women in these environments moving forward with the EU action plan. Thank you.
Fantastic. Oh, yes, and one final question.
Hi, my name is Emilia Castro. I work with UNOPS. So Anna from NATO mentioned that WPS is a joint effort, right? So how much cooperation or collaboration is there also with external action in terms of implementing also budgets and also expect to be a new DG Defense? So also given that most of the allies are also member states of the EU or the other way around. So how much cooperation is there between the two organizations to make sure that WPS and more naturally gender equality considerations are taken into account in what both of your organizations are doing? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for those great questions. So I'd like to invite the panel, but also Mariam and Caitlin online. If you'd like to come in, you're of course more than welcome. Any thoughts at all on those questions there? Jonna, would you like to kick off? As I think some of them are particularly directed to you.
I'm thinking, can I have more time? And I'm worried, which are the colleagues online at the moment? If there are any of our geodesks working on this context, they must be thinking, oh my God, what is she going to say? I'm going to start in an order that the questions were presented on SRHR first and the EU ability to step in. Of course, I am not speaking on behalf of our commission, especially that we are getting a new commission. So this will very largely also dictate the EU's priorities and the extent to which we'll be engaging on different thematics. However, having said that, I believe in von der Leyen's vision also for future for the foreign policy, or for there were elements that respectively reflected on there to be a gender roadmap and others. So I do believe that the new commission will be able to establish still gender equality, and within that SRHR related questions on the political agenda as well. Whether it comes to individual member states, I leave it there. But I would like to recall we are not the only entity in the world, and there are positive developments in the world of countries who have taken steps on SRHR as well. For example, in Latin American context. So I'm hoping that there will be actually a larger global alliance to support on SRHR related questions in case other, such as US, might be stepping out. Many of the organizations, of course, know already. They know how to preempt some of these threats, because this would not be the first time this happens. In terms of, there was a question on EU approach in hostile contexts. Our approach when it comes to supporting women remains very much the same. I mean, all the EU countries have signed up to supporting women's organizations. And also we do this very much in localized context. So a delegation has a lot of, I would say, political drive in order to make sure that the approach applies to the context where they are liaising. Having said this, we're certainly not the ideal partner in the world. But when it comes to very extremely, I would say, even authoritarian regimes, whether or not EU is the best interlocutor to engage with them on rights-related questions or women's rights is not necessary. That's a question in itself. In this, again, global partnerships, I think, will end up being a larger component than has been so far, or has to be considered as a larger component, because we need those allies beyond our usual member states to engage also with the hostile context. So however you would like to frame this. As to EU's approach, it's been, for example, with Afghanistan, very clearly communicated in Council conclusions. EU has placed women's rights and human rights, realization of human rights more broadly, but specifically realization of human rights for women as a high priority in terms of EU's engagements. Lastly, quickly on the NATO, of course, we know each other actually quite well. We do collaborate quite a bit. But I think the question is now, how do we elevate that to the others who work on the defense sector side on women, peace and security topics? So how do we, first of all, manage to mainstream internally in-house for all our interlocutors to understand that these are topics of strategic interest, and then have that in partnership with NATO? That is, that is something we are working.
Anna, do you want to?
Yes, just to say, just to basically join in on, or chime in with Jonna on that, we have a very good, both, I would say both formal and informal collaboration when it comes to women, peace and security. We even live quite close to one another. So we have lots of opportunities to discuss together. And as I said earlier, I mean, the SGSR, when she was hosting the first Women, Peace and Security, Allied Women, Peace and Security, Gender Equality and Feminist Foreign Policy Leaders meeting at NATO headquarters, we invited Jonna. And the SGSR, she's also participated in the EU's public relations campaign in relation to International Women's Day. So we do talk a lot, and we do try to figure out basically what are the synergies that we can use between one another, and how we can help one another as well, and actually advancing the agenda within our own institutions. Thank you.
Did you want to comment? And also, I know we haven't addressed the question about working with big international humanitarian organizations, for example.
Right. And I mean, this could be a topic of conversation in itself, right? But maybe just a very briefly respond. I think, as I said, like, it's a learning curve for ourselves also, right? Like, it's a steep learning curve. There's lots of things we need to change internally. And I would say there's capacity building and learning happening on all sides. It's the internally, how we're doing that, and how we're adapting our systems and our ways of thinking. And you cannot imagine how many conversations I had with our finance people to say, we actually want to give grants of 5,000 euros. And it's going to be so small because that's what they can absorb, and we'll build it up, right? So there's a lot of internal capacity building. There's the capacity building that happens with the WLOs, with the women-led organizations. And we've really learned to meet them where they're at. We've had instances where we meet organizations who do fantastic work. They're not legally registered, so they can't be considered. So we are able to then work with them in a way that provides them the support they need. And we offer them, would you be interested in getting registered? Because some do, some don't, for very particular protection reasons. They would not want to get formally registered, but those who do, we get a lawyer. We help them get their procedures and manuals in place and all of that. And we've seen that work really well with organizations that have never received funding to date. We give them what we call a deliverable-based contract modality, meaning they do not have to give us any financial reports. We agree with them on, like, this is programmatically what you want to achieve. This is how you set your measures of success, and you will measure it together. It's a trust-based relationship. And I cannot tell you, it's a really difficult one to do because not all the donors are there yet. But that is something for us that really works. And we've seen it work very effectively in places from Uzbekistan to Yemen to Central African Republic, where we've had organizations that started out with very little amounts like that, who then, through the work that we do with them, are able to access funding from the French embassy and others because they see they're capable of doing it. And we take them in a coaching approach where we say, you don't have to submit financial reports to us to get your next tranche, but do come to us, show us how you would do a financial report, how would you support the documentation that you have, and we give feedback on that. So it's like a learning process all the time. And then the third level of capacity building is what I would call educate your donors. So this is about what do we draw as lessons from what we see can and cannot work. And frankly, there's things that are not going to work, right? There's certain things we just have to work within the boundaries of what exists. But I do see that a lot of the donors that we work with, the intention is there, but they're also struggling and trying to figure out how to do it, right? So the more we can bring these type of very practical lessons and evidence of what works, the more progress we make. And I just want to make one more little comment on a different topic. It's about the question that was asked from the crisis group colleague, but also others about changing in political context and things becoming much more hostile. I agree with a lot of the analysis, but I also want to put out, I think in a lot of EU member states and elsewhere, we're up to governments who don't necessarily want to deliberately undermine the WPS agenda, but they don't know the WPS agenda, right? They are working, they've been brought forward on a platform of domestic concerns that are very far away from what we've been talking about today. And sometimes that requires a little bit of sensitization and education. I've seen numerous times where we actually go in and talk with a parliamentarian of people that I would, in full honesty, not vote for. But having a conversation and having them ask questions can open doors and can actually create alliances that we wouldn't find probable.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if Caitlin is still online, but do come in, Caitlin, if you want to add anything.
Thanks so much. I just wanted to make a quick point on the funding. I think the reality is funding envelopes globally for crises contexts are declining. I think anyone that has worked in a complex crisis has felt this. Even humanitarian response plans are not being funded to the full extent of the ask. So I think the question really is for donors and funders is how can we be smarter with the money that we have access to, and how can we really implement the very strong evidence base around how best to support women-led organizations. We all know the information, we know the data, we know about the core funding unregistered. So I think really the onus is on donors and funders is how do we really adapt our systems to meet those realities on the ground. I know it's a complex question, as the crisis group colleague said, there's, complex political cycles, decision makers and capitals that have different, considerations than those of us on the ground. But I think really it is the time for that. And on the question asked about kind of geopolitics and adapting approaches, I think the reality is that a lot of the WPS agenda funding is held by countries who are very supportive of the agenda. And so I think now the question is, how do we diversify those that support the agenda, fund it to partners that are less traditional? This is complex because less traditional partners might have a stake in conflict. That's kind of the complex geopolitical realities that we have to grapple with on the ground. But the diversification of those leading the agenda, I think, is really important in the adaptation to the realities that we're facing now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. Thank you very much again for all of those responses. I think we're going to draw to a close now because I'm really mindful of time and that it's a Monday evening and you're probably thinking, oh, I've got the rest of the week ahead of me. But just to say, again, a huge thank you to all of the panelists. If we could just give them a round of applause. Thank you to everyone who has made an intervention. I think we've heard some really, really interesting food for thought there, which we can take into our work over the coming months, both the realities of what's happening on the ground, what's happening at the EU and NATO levels, what's happening for CSOs. And then I personally found it very challenging, well, very sort of thought-provoking to be thinking about this question of how do we build up more with local actors? How do we really challenge ourselves and reflecting on whether this agenda is really facing up to the challenges of the moment? And I think that there were some really great speakers that were helping to challenge us. And I hope that we can take that discussion outside. I'd like to just say a huge thank you to the team that have worked so hard on pulling this event together. So in Florence's team in UN Women, Maritze, Leah, Sophie, Julia, and Florence, who have worked very closely together. and with my lovely colleague Nerea and Flannery, who I think is at the back, who've worked incredibly hard in making it all happen. A big thank you to you. Our next event will be on women and climate. It will be held around the COP, so please do try and come if you can, and please do have a drink outside. Thank you.